everyone. Welcome to Unit 4. We're moving on to the muscular system this week. So let's go ahead and jump in. So your muscular system has a few different roles in your body. But in order for the muscular system to work the way it does to move your body around in space and also to move things around inside your body, the tissue itself has to be excitable. So that means that it can respond to a stimulus from your nervous system. So nervous system is going to send an electrical signal. The muscle tissue has to be able to respond to that. And it responds to that by contracting, right? So the actual muscle fibers are going to shorten. So the muscle tissue has to be contractible. It also has to be extensible, meaning that we can stretch it, right? Because not always do we need it to contract. Sometimes we're going to need it to stretch, for example, around a joint. And it also has to be elastic. And elastic means that once you do stretch it, it's going to return to its original shape. All right, so the functions of your muscle tissue are to create motion. Essentially, muscle tissue is for moving stuff around. So we use our muscle tissue to move your body around, right? So skeletal muscle attaches to bones and it helps to move those bones around. We use it for our posture to help stabilize us and keep us walking upright. Um, we also use muscles to move things around inside our body. So moving around blood inside your body. So you've got smooth muscle that lines some of your blood vessels. You also have smooth muscle that lines all of the hollow organs in your digestive system. So we use peristaltic contractions to move stuff around inside that digestive system. Um, and the muscular system also helps you maintain your body temperature. So muscles are very energy intensive cells. So the cells there use a lot of ATP, and in burning all that ATP, they create a lot of heat. All right, so our three different types of muscle tissue here. So skeletal muscle, this is the voluntary type of muscle that you have. So this is the muscle that's going to be attached to bones, the muscle that you get to choose when you flex, when you relax these particular muscles. So if you look at skeletal muscle under the microscope, it's going to look striated. So striated means it's got a striped appearance to it. The skeletal muscle fibers themselves are really long, so these are elongated, and they have multiple nuclei, right? So lots of nuclei that tend to get pushed off to the side, right? Cardiac muscle tissue, this is involuntary, and we find it only in the heart. Cardiac muscle tissue is also striated, but instead of being long parallel fibers, it tends to have more kind of like a branched appearance to it, and usually just one single central nucleus there. And then smooth muscle or visceral muscle, this one is not striated, so we can't see the stripes on the inside of the actual muscle cell here. But this smooth muscle you find all over the body. It's involuntary, so we can't choose when we flex these muscles. But this is the type of muscle that you find in your blood vessels, in your uterus, in your digestive tract, in your lungs. We find lots of smooth muscle. All right, so here are some pictures of muscle. You should be able to tell the difference between the type of muscle tissue by looking at photos like this, right? So the top one up there is skeletal muscle, and we can tell that it's skeletal muscle because it's long parallel fibers. The nuclei are pushed off to the side, and there's a striated appearance to it. The middle picture there is of smooth muscle. We can tell it's smooth because just one single central nucleus. We don't see the striations. We see these kind of tapered cells that are kind of packed close to one another. And then the picture on the bottom there, C, is a cardiac muscle. Again, we can tell it's cardiac muscle because of the branching pattern, the striations, the central nuclei, and also cardiac muscle has those intercalated discs. Those intercalated discs are going to be important for sending electrical signals. Okay, so let's dig into what muscle tissue actually looks like here at a microscopic level, how it's organized. All right, so we have muscle cells, but the muscle cells are not on their own, right? So every muscle cell is going to be covered in connective tissue. And we've got multiple different layers of connective tissue that are going to be holding your muscle organs together, right? And so these are the epimysium, paramysium, endomysium. Anytime you see that root, the MYS, that's referring to muscle tissue. So these are all connective tissues that surround the muscles. Right, so if we're looking at, let me grab my highlighter here. If we're looking at this picture here, around the ends of the muscle, we see the tendons, right? And tendons are connective tissue that help connect the muscle to the bone. These tendons, the connective tissue here is actually made up of endomysium, paramysium, epimysium that are surrounding each one of the muscle cells, right? So, and we'll talk about how those look here. All right, so here we're kind of zooming in a little bit more. So we can still see the tendon here. So here's our tendon that's connecting this muscle to the bone. All right, and that's connective tissue that's sort of wrapping itself around the muscle itself. So the outer layer of connective tissue that's wrapping around the entire muscle is called epimysium. So epimysium surrounds the entire muscle. And then if we zoom into that a little bit further, we can see that around this, inside this entire muscle, there are these bundles, right? These bundles of muscle cells here are called fascicles. Right? And each fascicle is going to be surrounded by another layer of tissue, and that's the paramysium. So paramysium surrounds fascicles. Fascicles get bound together in a big uh, muscle, and then that's surrounded by epimysium. If we zoom in a little bit smaller, in each one of these fascicles down here, so this is a fascicle, inside each one of these fascicles, we're going to have the individual muscle fibers. So muscle fiber is just another name for a muscle cell, right? So, and the muscle fiber right there is going to be surrounded by endomysium. So endomysium is the one that surrounds a single muscle fiber. All right, so now we're zoomed into that single muscle fiber, and we can see here's our muscle fiber, here's the endomysium that's surrounding it. Um, so when we bound a whole bunch of these muscle fibers together, we get a fascicle. Each fascicle is surrounded by paramysium. And when we bundle a whole bunch of fascicles together, we get a muscle, and each muscle is covered by epimysium. So they go in order. Epimysium is the most superficial covering, and then that epimysium surrounds the entire muscle. The muscle is composed of fascicles. Each fascicle is surrounded by paramysium. Fascicles are comprised of individual muscle fibers. Those individual muscle fibers are each surrounded by endomysium. All right, so I know that's a little bit confusing. So take your time and make sure that you understand those different layers of tissue. The one other thing I want to point out on this slide here is that underneath the endomysium that's covering an individual muscle fiber is going to be the actual cell membrane of that muscle cell. And the cell membrane for muscle cells has a different name. So instead of just calling it a plasma membrane or a cell membrane, we call it a sarcolemma. So, and that's this word here. So sarcolemma is the name for the actual plasma membrane of a muscle cell. All right, so here's this kind of view again, so we can see all of these layers of tissue. So here's our tendon that's attaching the muscle to the bone. That tendon is going to be comprised of all of the connective tissue that's surrounding each one of these muscle fibers. So here's our entire muscle. The entire muscle here is surrounded by epimysium. That entire muscle is composed of fascicles. The fascicles are each individually wrapped in paramysium. And then if we look inside a fascicle, we can see a fascicle is comprised of individual muscle fibers. Each one of those fibers is covered in endomysium. And then underneath that endomysium is where we find the sarcolemma, which is the cell membrane of a muscle cell, of a muscle fiber. Okay, so if that wasn't enough connective tissue for you, there's more. So we also have fascia. So fascia is connective tissue that's going to connect multiple different muscles together, right? So here we're looking at a cadaver. We can see a big sheet of fascia here that's surrounding all of the abdominal muscles. right? So fascia is what's going to connect multiple different muscles together. Okay. One more type of connective tissue. I think this is the last one. I hope so. And that's an aponeurosis. So an aponeurosis is a sheet of connective tissue that's going to attach the belly of one muscle to the belly of another muscle. So this we find in a few places in the body, not super common, but the main one that you should be familiar with is this one on this picture here, the epicranial aponeurosis. Epicranial aponeurosis is a sheet of connective tissue that kind of wraps around the top of your skull. It's connecting two different muscles together. The first muscle it's connecting is the frontalis muscle. So frontalis is this muscle of your forehead. When you contract this one, he helps you raise your eyebrows. He's going to connect to that epicranial aponeurosis all the way to another muscle on the back of your head called the occipitalis. So it connects those two muscles together. Right, so that's an aponeurosis. All right, so looking at these muscle fibers a little bit more closely now. So let's look at an individual muscle cell or muscle fiber. And this one is a skeletal muscle fiber, and that's what we're going to be using for most of for the rest of the lecture here. We're going to be talking about the skeletal muscles. Very long muscle fibers. Some of these muscle fibers, they go the entire length of your muscles, right? So they go all the way from where that muscle inserts or where it originates to where it inserts. So all of the entire length of the muscle. So these are really long cells, which means they have to have lots of nuclei, right? And so those nuclei, again, kind of get pushed off to the side of the cell. So we can see multiple nuclei here pushed off to the side because most of the cell here is taken up by bundles of protein that we call myofibrils. So again, that myo root refers to muscle. So myofibrils are these kind of long tubes of protein that are really filling up the entirety of a muscle cell. Right. So again, some terminology here. So we mentioned that the sarcolemma is the plasma membrane of a muscle cell. The muscle cells also get a different name for their cytoplasm. So instead of just calling it cytoplasm, we call it sarcoplasm. And the root or sarco just means flesh. So we're talking about flesh or muscle tissue here. So sarcoplasm means the cytoplasm of a muscle cell, right? So we've got that sarcoplasm, and then within that is all of these myofibrils. That's all of these kind of long fibers of protein that are stacked up next to each other, and we're gonna see how that helps a muscle contract. All right, so looking inside at those myofibrils. So here we can see, let's kind of just look at this one myofibril here. Now here's where we can see some of those striations, right? So we can see the fact that there's these different kind of stripes of protein inside of each muscle cell, and that's because of the actual different types of protein that are creating these myofibrils. So two main types of protein here, and those are actin and myosin, sometimes called the thin filament and the thick filament. So if we kind of zoom in on that here, so if we're looking at this section of the myofibril, when we zoom in closer to it up here, we can see that we've got some of these proteins here, the ones represented as blue, are thick proteins. And then we've got some of these thinner proteins. And the fact that we've got thick ones next to thin ones, and then more thick ones, and then more thin ones, that's what gives us that kind of stripy overall appearance of a muscle fiber. Right, so all of your myofibrils are composed of alternating thick and thin filaments, and that's what creates that striped appearance. Okay, so when we talked about bones, we talked about how the functional unit of a bone is an osteon. So an osteon is what gets repeated over and over again to give you bony tissue. Muscles are also kind of comprised of functional units. The functional unit or a single contractile unit of a muscle fiber is called a sarcomere. So a sarcomere is a single contractile unit of muscle fiber. It's composed of those thick and thin filaments. So here we can see, there we go. Um, one of those sarcomeres. So we can see that we've got the thick filaments alternating with the thin filaments, and then we end the sarcomere at what we call Z lines or Z discs. So those Z lines are marking the beginning and the end of sarcomere, right? And so inside that sarcomere, we've got the thick filaments and the thin filaments that are alternating. And this sarcomere is what's going to contract. This is how muscles are going to contract, is by pulling those Z lines closer together. As we pull the Z lines closer together, the overall muscle fiber gets shorter, and that's what allows for a muscle to contract. And we'll talk about how that happens here in a second. All right, so zoomed in even closer on the actual proteins that are inside that sarcomere. So here we can see the thick and thin filaments again. The thick filament is myosin. So myosin is the thick filament. So we find the myosin here, in this picture it's represented as red. The myosin is composing the middle of the sarcomere. So we find these thick proteins here in the middle. Actin is the thin filament. So actin is represented here as these kind of little yellow beads. So those little yellow beads, strings of beads there are the actin filaments or the thin filaments, right? And so what's going to happen here is that the myosin that's in the middle of the sarcomere is actually going to grab onto the actin and pull that actin closer together. So it's going to shorten the overall sarcomere by bringing those Z lines or Z discs a little bit closer together. All right, so let's review real quick before we move on any further here. So what type of muscle is striated? So think about what type of muscle has that striated appearance. And think about what type of muscles are voluntary, what type are involuntary, which ones are we going to find inside the walls of your arteries, which ones do we find inside your GI tract, in your trachea and bronchi, so in your lungs, and which ones are in the uterus. So think about, and those are your three types of muscle there. So of these three types, where do we find these guys? Give you a second to think about it. All right, there we go. So striated muscle is going to be skeletal and cardiac. So both of those types are striated. The only voluntary muscle type you have is skeletal. So the other two types are definitely involuntary. So cardiac and smooth are involuntary muscle. In your artery walls, that's smooth muscle. In your GI tract, smooth muscle. In your lungs, smooth muscle. In your uterus, smooth muscle. So most of the stuff on the inside of your body that you don't really have conscious control over, that's all going to be smooth muscle tissue. All right, one more question here. Referring to the connective tissue layers around each organization of muscle here. So what connective tissue layer surrounds a single muscle cell, a single muscle fiber? Which layer surrounds a group of fibers or a fascicle? What layer surrounds an entire muscle? And then what layer is going to connect multiple or cover multiple muscles together? All right, give you a second. Okay, so here we go. The one that surrounds the single individual muscle fiber is the endomysium. The paramysium is what surrounds the fascicle or a group of fibers. Epimysium surrounds the entire muscle, and then fascia is what's going to cover multiple muscles. All right, another question here dealing with the terminology of muscle tissue. So the cytoplasm of a muscle cell, what's that called? The membrane of a muscle cell, a single contractile unit of muscle, so the functional unit of a muscle cell, a fiber of contractile units, and then the thick and thin filaments. And there's your word bank at the bottom, so see if you can figure out which one goes where. All right, there we go. So the cytoplasm of a muscle cell is sarcoplasm. The membrane is the sarcolemma. A single contractile unit is a sarcomere. A fiber of contractile units, so the fibers that are inside the muscle cells, those are called myofibrils. And the myofibrils are composed of thick and thin filaments. The thick filament is myosin and the thin filament is actin. All right, so hopefully this is starting to make a little bit of sense, and we'll talk again in the next lecture. Let me know if you have any questions.